Determination, grit, tenacity, and sheer balling simply for the love of the game, round 2 of the Women's Africa Cup of Nations had all that to offer and then some. Welcome back to Meet My Pantheon, and let's get right back into it. Beginning with Group A, and Senegal took on Kenya, and right off the bat it must be noted that both teams showed a highly marked improvement in both of their performances, especially when you consider what they turned up with in the previous round. Now, Kenya in particular were very good going up top, but unfortunately the defense's improvement did not last all that long, as Senegal would soon expose them, as they were by far and away the better team and really should have scored way more than just the one goal that they did. But also, as much as Senegal were good going forward, I must unfortunately pick at their goalkeeper Haji, who was an opposition player at times, because there were moments where she just seemed unsure of herself, and even her defenders looked unsure of her. And really, if Kenya had their shooting boots on, I think that they might have gotten away with something. But thankfully, in the end, Senegal, like I already said, they ran out 1-0 winners and gave themselves just a little sliver of an inkling of qualification going into the final round of the group stages. Whereas Kenya, they're completely out. They've got no chance whatsoever, but credit must be given to the Kenyans for ultimately putting on a better performance. But this performance, as good as it was not good enough to see them get anything out of this game. Following on from this encounter, we had the Maghreb Derby between host Morocco and Algeria, and this was actually a very entertaining match, especially from a tactical point of view. This was much more staunch opposition for Morocco, and they were made to actually work this time round. This was not an exhibition or training match like they had against Kenya. This was a proper football match, and Algeria did their very best to keep Morocco honest throughout the 90 minutes of the game. The Algerians themselves were very good value for their money and did have a few chances throughout the game to potentially get themselves an opener and potentially, of course, get themselves a shock victory over the hosts. But it was not meant to be, and Morocco, for their credit, they did their very best to try and get themselves ahead, especially with the home support just cheering them on. But honestly, going into the very dying embers of the game, it did not look like anything was going to break. It seemed like both teams were going to have to share the spoils and each go up to 4 points apiece. But there was a last little bit of excellent awareness from Masuni, which ultimately sealed the winner for the hosts. But as much as Morocco came out on top with a very slim 1-0 victory in the end, Algeria must be given their credit, because they really did their best to keep the Moroccans quiet, and it was just a simple level of like dropping their concentration levels at the moment they needed it the most that ultimately cost them in this match. But thankfully for them, they still got a chance at qualification. But for Morocco, they have now qualified into the knockout rounds of the WAFCON tournament. Moving on to Group B, and we had South Africa take on Ivory Coast in a game where the Ivorians were looking to be the ones to send South Africa home early, and Banyana, for their efforts, they were looking to get themselves some points on the board so that they could at least keep their hopes of continuing into the knockouts alive just by a little bit. Now, going into this match itself, South Africa were initially the better team, and it seemed that they had learned from their prior encounter against Tanzania about learning to defend better, especially against counters. However, Cote d'Ivoire's Seri would soon prove that to be completely false, as she would bag herself a sensational brace whilst the South African defense was completely asleep and their keeper was hopelessly caught out on both occasions. The Ivorians had the South Africans on the rocks on so many an occasion, and as the game headed down to the last 20 minutes, it seemed like it was all over for Banyana. However, taliswoman Kgatlana would soon step up and score a sensational goal into the top bin, and Super Sub Magaya would finally also score a goal, which allowed for South Africa to come back into the game and ultimately share the points. Now, the Ivorians will obviously be disappointed with such a result, even though they managed to get themselves now 4 points and pretty much guarantee themselves a spot in the knockout stages. But for South Africa, they are still very much defunct at the back and honestly are ripe for the picking in their next match against Burkina Faso, who, as much as they're an inferior opposition, they will watch the Tanzania game and they will watch the Ivory Coast game against South Africa and know that the defense is there to be picked apart. Because when you watch this match, Ivory Coast really should have done a better job of picking the South Africans apart, and they do deserve to qualify, but honestly, South Africa will be grateful that they also just managed to get a draw out of this. Otherwise, it would have been a national tragedy. And speaking of Burkina Faso, their group encounter against Tanzania promised to be one that was going to be very audacious, if not memorable, given what we saw from Tanzania. Now, going into the game, as expected, the Twiga Stars started off very well and had many chances to open the scoring, but they were just missing their shooting boots, something I've already talked about in many matches already so far at this WAFCON. And funny enough, though the Tanzanians did not have their shooting boots on, the Burkinabe actually did, because a cheeky chip from Cabre would give them the shock lead. And honestly, things could not get any better for the Burkinabe, as Tanzania's Ubamba was sent off after a studs-up challenge. But even though the Twiga Stars were a player down, their resilience and their tenacity would not relent, and soon enough they would get their leveler after a very scrappy free kick routine. At this point in time, the Lady Stallions of Burkina Faso were reeling, and it looked at some point that Tanzania were surely going to do the unthinkable. But Lady Luck had other ideas, as the Lady Stallions would actually be the ones to score the winner after a loose ball in the Tanzanian box would be reacted upon initially by Kawadogo, who thought first and shot first to make sure that Burkina Faso would get their first victory at this edition of the WAFCON tournament and keep their hopes alive of qualifying for the knockouts. Moving on to Group C and surprise package of the tournament, Malawi took on Egypt. And like I said in the game of Senegal versus Kenya, Egypt showed a marked improvement from their previous encounter against Zambia. But as much as the Egyptians did make the Malawans work for their initial opener, once the floodgates were opened, the Scorchers came through and burnt everything to the ground. Because none other than Temwa Chawinga, undeniably the MVP of the tournament so far, landed the assist for Gadzere to open the scoring before Chinzumu doubled for the Scorchers heading into halftime. Now, much like their fellow debutants Tanzania, Malawi were left with 10 players on the pitch, except this time it was early on in the second half. And even though the Scorchers were down to 10 players, they continued to push and to fight much like the Tanzanians, except in this regard, 1, they already had the lead, 2, they actually went and added to that lead, with Kadzere and Temwa Chawinga swapping roles from assister to goal scorer and from goal scorer to assister. And on the part of the Cleopatras, they would also get themselves a consolation goal, but ultimately it was not enough, as Malawi would run out 3-1 winners to guarantee themselves a spot in the knockout stages, whereas the Cleopatras bow out with at least a goal to their name. Following up from this, we had arguably the most important and pivotal match of the AFCON tournament so far, with Nigeria taking on Zambia. Now, of course, Nigeria are the current holders of the WAFCON crown, and having suffered a shock defeat at the hands of Malawi in the last round, they were fighting for their lives. And Zambia, for their part, they already have points on the board, but they were also looking to be party poopers, just like Cote d'Ivoire in Group B, and hopefully be the ones to send the champions packing early. Now, with the stage set in terms of narratives and so on and so forth, the actual action on the pitch was just crazy. As soon as the first whistle blew, both teams were going at it, gung-ho, guns blazing, everything. This was the equivalent of just no defending, all-out attack, FIFA 16. If you know, you know. And both teams, again, they went at it with counterattack after counterattack. Barbara Banda had her opportunities to score first. Asisa Oshoala also had her opportunities to score first. And between the two, it would be Oshoala who would make the net ripple first, because she was on demon time and she was looking to punch in the hours. And after some very poor defensive communication from Zambia, Oshoala would be the one to open the scoring in the game. Now, as the clock wound down down from the first half into the second half and into extra time, Zambia tried to respond, and they did indeed have their moments, especially with the likes of Rachel Kundananji, but Nigeria's defense, just like Oshoala, they were on demon time. They had some debts to pay, and it seemed like nothing was going to stand in their way, even though they had one of their defenders in Demihin getting sent off for a denial of a clear goal scoring opportunity just before halftime. But in spite of this, Zambia could not do anything to make the extra player count, as come the final whistle, Nigeria would be the team to get all 3 points and keep their hopes of qualifying for the knockout stages alive. Group D would hope to follow on and keep up with the intensity and the pace of Group B and C's jeopardy. However, when it came to the first match between Ghana versus Cameroon, this was not meant to be. As much as the Black Queens did try to do their very best to keep up the intensity as mentioned before, Cameroon for their part, they were not interested in it at all. And to be fair, you can't really blame them considering when you look at both teams on paper, the Ghanaians were definitely the stronger of the two, so it was definitely in Cameroon's interest to just play a very staunchly defensive game and just hope for a sliver of a chance to just potentially nick a result. And nick a result they did, because funny enough, they got themselves a penalty which they converted. And for the rest of the game, they just parked the bus, frustrated the Ghanaians to no end. Whilst the Cameroonian defense was very sloppy, their midfield was top, and they just gunked up everything that the Ghanaians tried to do. And ultimately, come the final whistle, Cameroon run out successful 1-0 winners, get themselves a spot in the knockout stages, and leave Ghana reeling and hoping to guarantee themselves a spot in the knockout stages in the provision that they defeat their final opponents in the group stage, Mali. And speaking of Mali, their game against Cabo Verde would round out the action of the round. And this game thankfully would help to reignite the hype of Group B and Group C's intensity and tenacity and jeopardy, as the game started very scrappily, but thanks to that kind of scrappy action, it would see the opener courtesy of a Koone volley to give Mali the early lead. But not to be outdone, the Blue Sharks would come kicking literally just a few minutes later and made history with their first goal ever at WAFCON, thanks to Barreira, who scored just 7 minutes after the opening goal of the game. Mali would eventually take control in the second half and would get 2 extra goals to give themselves a comfortable lead, with the Cabo Verde defense just completely being asleep, something that is a common theme as we know. However, the Blue Sharks again would not take things lying down, as Kelly would score the consolation goal for Cabo Verde, as Mali would ultimately run out narrow but successful 3-2 winners and give themselves also another shot at potentially, just potentially, making it into the knockout stages, provided that they can actually overcome Ghana in their final group round game. But for Cabo Verde, it does mean that this is the end of their time at WAFCON, but what a way to bow out. And they've got one more game to just leave a mark and a lasting impression, and what has been, in my view, a very good tournament for the team overall. And with round 2's action in the books, these are the current standings of the 4 groups at WAFCON. Now, by the time that this video is live, i.e. the time you're listening to it now, Group A fixtures will have finally concluded, and of course, as we know, Morocco have already qualified, but it's going to be a toss-up between Algeria and Senegal to see who else qualifies into the knockout stages of WAFCON from Group A. Anything could happen. I personally think it's going to be Algeria, but Kenya could pull an upset, Senegal could pull an upset. We never know. We'll just have to wait and see. Group B, it's still led by Ivory Coast, but none of the teams in this group have automatically qualified to the knockout stages, and it's really a toss-up between the teams that could qualify, because realistically speaking, any team can potentially qualify here. But it's really tight margins, and given that the final matches are going to be Ivory Coast versus Tanzania and Burkina Faso versus South Africa, honestly, it could go any which way. So all teams are going to be definitely fighting it out to try and get themselves a spot in the knockouts. Group C, Malawi have already automatically qualified, so that means only one spot is left between Nigeria and Zambia, which is very interesting because Malawi have Zambia next and Nigeria have Egypt next. So of course it would be expected the Super Falcons to sweep aside the Cleopatras, but at the same time, you never know what could happen between the Scorchers and the Copper Queens. It's gonna be an interesting one to look out for sure. And finally, Group D, Cameroon have automatically qualified, but of course, as I mentioned before, Ghana and Mali will be facing off against each other in their final group stage encounter for a spot in the knockouts. And with that being all said and done, that is going to be it for today's video. If you have a standout match, or if you think something in particular stood out in this round of fixtures, let me know in the comments below. What is your favorite match, what is your favorite call, and anything else in between. And yes, I already talked about the empty stadiums. It's in the previous video. Please feel free to go watch it to hear my full rant about it. But until then, thank you very much for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.